welcome to EoZTV. I'm Elder of Zion, and today my guest is Jennifer Dyer. She blogs under the name or the initials of J.E. Dyer, a retired commander of the U.S. Navy. Welcome, Jennifer.
Thank you. Good to be with you.
Thanks. Unfortunately, we couldn't get the camera working, so this is going to be the first audio or almost audio only EoZTV. But I do appreciate it. I've had the opportunity to have correspondence with Jennifer in years past. She's been extremely helpful. She knows her stuff. I thoroughly encourage everybody to read. She writes at Liberty Unyielding is the name of the blog that she's most often writing at. She's been on Fox News and other places. Every time that I'll read an analysis in a mainstream magazine that seems like a reasonable military analysis, but since I'm not a military person at all, and then when I read her stuff, it just blows me away because there's some people that pretend to know, and there's some people who actually know, and you definitely know your stuff.
Well, thank you very much. I can't wait to hear what I'm going to say after an introduction like that.
Okay, thanks. I would like to just see if I could just send one more tweet out because I want to just get a few more people on live. Just if you don't mind, I don't usually try to do this while I'm talking, but it would be a nice thing just to get a few more people on right now. Okay, happening now. Very good. Okay, so I have a few things I wanted to talk to you about, and usually, as you can imagine, I usually only talk about Israeli or Jewish subjects and that sort of thing. But there's a lot of other stuff going on right now, and I know that you've been writing a lot about it. And this is, of course, the current riots that are going on for the I would call it a murder of George Floyd. Obviously, I don't think you would disagree that everybody agrees that that his death itself was completely unconscionable. But talk to me a little bit about how you're seeing both the responses, the rioting, and as well as the police response and that has been happening.
Yes, it's hard to imagine anyone who doesn't agree that George Floyd was murdered. I think you'd be hard put to find a jury that wasn't already, biased toward that kind of a verdict. The riot response, I think, has been opportunistic, and I would distinguish the riots from the protests. There are people who legitimately want to go out and protest something like this. And that's very understandable. And President Trump has spoken to that every time he's talked about this issue. And I think America is 100% in agreement on that people have every right to protest. The riots are not a manifestation of rage about that. The riots are clearly being fomented by radicals. Antifa is the word that comes to everyone's mind. It's probably not just Antifa. There are other organizations involved, but the riots are coming about because of that. And there are also some social problems that have fed into it for a long time that make it fertile ground for those people to do their work. But it's clear that the riots they have a political agenda that's completely separate from justice for George Floyd. And George Floyd's family has come out and said, these riots are not justice for George. People, please stop it. And Martin Luther King's surviving family members, the wonderful people from his family who do, great work out in the community trying to spread the message that he brought, they have said the same thing, that this is not what Martin Luther King Jr. would approve of or do, and it's not helpful, and it has nothing to do with justice. So I think America is very much agreed on that. And the police response, there are a couple of points to make about that. One is that I think everyone was a little disappointed in the response of the whole political chain of command in Minneapolis. That was unfortunate. It it seemed to take a while for the police department to even acknowledge that they were looking into this and that they were going to give it wire brushing as opposed to just assuming, making assumptions in favor of their officers. And the response has been pretty weak from the mayor of Minneapolis and the governor of Minnesota. So those things have not helped. I do think they're on the right path there. They've charged the officer. All four of the officers that were there have been fired from the force, and the officer who had his knee on George Floyd has been arrested and charged. And those seem like the right things to do. And we can hope that a trial is going to give this a really good look over, and people will feel that the truth actually came out. So I'm hopeful in that regard. As for the police response across the country, there have been very good police responses and some that have been not so good. And it varies from place to place. I think it's kind of hard to put a characteristic on it and say, well, one political side's doing it right and the other's doing it wrong. Philadelphia, for example, always votes heavily Democratic, and yet they've had a pretty good police response. There are some places that vote Republican, like, well, actually, I'm having difficulty thinking of one, but you could probably find that Republican voting places where the police response has been less than great. The bottom line, though, for the police forces seems to be how much backing they're getting from their local governments, from the mayors and the city councils. And where that backing is strong, the police have been more effective.
Okay. President Trump said that he was interested in sending in the National Guard. Is that and other people obviously are very critical of that idea, saying it's militarizing the response. What do you think?
Well, the sending in the National Guard as the National Guard is something that the governors have to do, and Trump's message to the governors was, I'm going to let you make the choice about that. But if you don't get your states under control, if the American people are still seeing their businesses smashed up and losing everything that they've worked all their lives for, then I, President Trump, will have to step in. And if he deploys troops, right now, what the word is it would be under the Insurrection Act of 1807. And he has a lawful method of deploying troops, but they would be federal troops. So it would be the U.S. military that he's deploying. It would not be the National Guard. The governors activate the Guard, and then Trump would deploy the military. And of course, everyone is understandably and rightfully leery of a president doing that. It's not that it has not happened before. He sent federal troops into Los Angeles for George H.W. Bush sent federal troops into Los Angeles in 1992 after the Rodney King riots.
When you say troops, you mean U.S. Army, or is there something else?
U.S. Army, that's right.
Okay, so
yeah, he sent in federal troops. It wasn't just the National Guard.
Mm-hmm.
And there have been times in the last century when that has been done. So it's not unthinkable, but it's extremely rare. And typically what we see is the governors calling out the National Guard.
Okay. So that okay. So is I mean, these are obviously riots that are going on over here. Do does the National Guard or the Army have the expertise to deal with riots, or would they have it? You know, would things get worse?
Well, the thinking is, first of all, they do exactly that kind of training. They don't do it for operations in the United States, but they do it for operations overseas. Um,
Mhm.
Counterinsurgency ops, military operations in urban terrain. Those are core competencies for the Army. So they do have that kind of expertise resonant with them. And to some extent, they have worked with federal agencies on the US border to assist in some activities of that kind. If that there hasn't been a whole lot in the last 3 or 4 decades, at least. But what they're doing right now in Philadelphia is probably a model for what they would at least try to do, which is create secure areas that are heavily armed and guarded by the military so that people can't get into them.
Mhm.
So the military is not having to deal directly with the crowds. And then the police will be the ones who do the contact uh, policing activity with the local crowds. And that's generally the model that I think everyone is looking at. One of the places they would do it, we've had the crowds swarming onto the freeways, the interstate highways in
Right.
some of the big cities. And that's something federal troops could do is come in and block those off so that the people can't even get onto them. And that would funnel them off to areas where the police would then be doing the contact
Oh,
with rioters.
okay. That yeah, that makes sense. I see that. So the anti-Israel agitators and activists like to pretend that the IDF treats that they're terrible in how they treat Arabs when they're doing their own riots and their own demonstrations. So they like to say, oh, the U.S. police learned all of this stuff from Israel. I wrote a piece in which I said, actually, if the U.S. police understood how Israel was doing things, there would be a lot fewer injuries going on right now. And what I and again, I'm trying to get this as a fact check from you. It seems to me that one, Israel has some technologies that I don't think are being used here for riot control, and two is Israel seems to have very well thought out procedures on how exactly to deal with these sort of things. And I'm not seeing that in some of the bad video. I mean, I'm not looking at all of them, but obviously the ones that are really horrific are the ones that show up, like the New York Police Department ramming into the crowd and that sort of thing. And it looks to me when I'm seeing that is that they don't really understand. They don't have procedures. They don't know what to do. And when you don't have the procedures, and then you panic, and then you do the wrong thing. Am I getting that sort of right?
Um, I think that's partially right in some places. The I don't think we have a good I don't think we have good visibility on how good their procedures are because I have seen, I'm trying to think, it's at least three, um, a sheriff and I believe two retired police chiefs that I can remember in the last week have been on the TV, on the news channels, uh, stating that the police and the sheriffs, they have separate jobs, but they do a lot of the same things. Just depends on where their jurisdiction is,
Mhm.
and they're not being allowed to uh, implement the measures that they train on and know how to use. There are places where they're not being allowed to do that. The mayor is not permitting them to do that.
Um,
And so I think unless we actually saw them using those measures and could judge how well they do it. I'm wary right now of coming to that conclusion. That being said, the IDF, I think, people would acknowledge over here that they deal with this every single day. So they're very, very good at it, and I'm sure that they do have things that they could teach our police.
Okay. Thank you. The Just while we're talking about Israel, since I'll have to segue into it somehow, the I wanted to ask you, the right now all the talk and today there's talk that it might not happen, but there's the talk of that Israel is going to extend its sovereignty and extend its laws over portions of Judea and Samaria, what the world calls the West Bank. One of the arguments that's usually used from Israel in order to maintain control over those is the military view, both from the perspective of the higher ground in the Judean hills, as well as the the actual having a border with Jordan, and not and in order to be able to have that strategic depth. Can you go into that a little bit of how that works from a military perspective?
Yes. Well, one thing I would mention is that there have been two uh, really in-depth looks at that I'm aware of. There may have been more, but the Alon plan that was generated in the late 1960s with General Alon looked at where you would need to the terrain that you would need to hold if you needed to defend. And basically, you have to keep anything from getting across the Jordan. You can't let it get across the Jordan, so you have to be able to defend from the heights and prevent movement across the Jordan. And a map was drawn out of that, showing the areas of the mountains around Jerusalem that you would need to hold to be able to do that effectively, and the roads that you would have to maintain control of. And then in around the 2004 time frame, Ariel Sharon had another look at it, and this was when the discussion was underway about turning Gaza over, and so it was a big scrub of Israeli security at the time. And basically, although the Alon plan was kind of the basis of what they were looking at, he ended up identifying settlements that would have to be retained and territory that would have to be retained around the settlements to get that job done. And things have only gotten more, it's only more urgent and necessary since that time to do that. And that's partly because of the increased accuracy of over the horizon or indirect firepower that could be achieved by anyone who is attacking Israel from the east. It's not just range, it's accuracy, and the accuracy is one of the things that's really ramped up. But another thing is that Iran is in Iraq. Iran is in Iraq with the military forces it would need. And it has been working really hard on opening two pathways across Iraq. One goes to the north through Syria, and the other across far western Iraq, the desert area. And that one would have to go through Jordan, but the area that's in Jordan would not be hard to overwhelm. So there are a couple of avenues that Israel has to be concerned about with ensuring that there can't be an effective attack across the Jordan. And Iran has already moved as much as 400, 500 miles closer
Hmm.
It's not just in Iraq, it's in Syria as well. But Iraq is particularly dangerous because there are areas where you can go directly across Anbar province or up the Euphrates and then come down through central Syria. So Israel has to be constantly concerned. That's one reason that they needed to extend sovereignty over the Golan Heights,
Sure.
is so that Israel would just hold that without trying to pull punches there or share sovereignty or anything like that. Israel has to do that because of what's in Syria now, and it's becoming increasingly necessary to ensure that Israel has civil as well as military sovereignty, just because it's important that uh, that security problems not be able to erupt in the midst of the territory that Israel has to hold in order to defend to the east, now that Iran has moved assets so much closer.
Essentially, you're saying
That's one of the big
gotta be.
major missile movements that I would point out.
Are you saying essentially, and you're starting to break up, unfortunately, but are you saying essentially the worries about having a fifth column if Israel doesn't have civil control?
That certainly, and that could be from a number of sources. Uh, could be from Hezbollah, Hamas, Quds Force sneaking some of their Tiger brigades in there in very small cells, things like that.
Okay, because that's what I was wondering. Because again, when you're saying as far as accuracy of weapons, obviously Iran can shoot straight from Iran. So as far as rockets are concerned, I'm not quite certain what the depth actually buys. I can certainly see it from the perspective of the ground troops.
Iran can shoot straight from Iran, but those are easier to shoot down.
Oh,
Israel sees those coming from much further away. There's more alertment.
uh-huh.
If they can move in closer, then it becomes much harder. As good as Iron Dome is, it can be overwhelmed if you get enough uh, assets in there firing a whole bunch of rockets at once.
Uh-huh. That makes
So you need to be able to keep them outside of a perimeter so that they can't do that.
Okay, that makes sense. But again, Iran would probably be coming in through, like you said, through Syria or Lebanon. It doesn't seem that they would be going in through Jordan. So I'm still trying to make sure I understand what the. I mean, there's always a chance, obviously the Jordan can fall or something, so I could see that. But if Jordan holds, is there, what military advantage is there to maintaining the Judean Samaria?
Well, Iran will try, unless Jordan is built up a lot in that area, it wouldn't be that hard to get troops across within the space of a few days. It's definitely something you always have to look at. Iran does not want to have to launch an all-out attack on Israel from only one vector. And Syria and Lebanon would be the same vector because of the terrain up there. That's one vector. Um, so Iran would want to launch it from the Jordan as well. And you need to be able to defend and have it hard and basically unprovable to ensure that they can't get across. The current situation is not stable in my view, but if Iran continues to push year after year, it can be destabilized. Jordan would not be that difficult to destabilize if a great deal were put into it. And I believe it would take some time. There are people who think it would take less time than I do, but nevertheless, it's not something that's not impossible. Nobody thought that Iran would be this far into Iraq at this point either, and yet they are. Basically, Iran has military assets in Iraq. They're called Iraqi paramilitary forces, but they're controlled by Iran, and they're equipped with missiles that can already reach Israel. So the situation has gotten worse in recent years and not better in those terms. And it's not yet going the right direction. Jordan would need to be more unified and important for Israel to be able to be complacent about what might come across the Jordan. And Iran will not stop trying to probe upon that vector, because a single drone attack is much less likely to work than coming in from both the north, which is Syria and Lebanon, and from the east, which would be across Jordan.
Sure. Again, the audio is starting to get a bit hard, but we'll try a little bit more and see what happens. So I apologize to anyone listening. The other thing I wanted to mention or to talk about is, according to reports, and it seems like it's fairly obvious that it's true, Israel, I mean, Iran had some sort of a cyber attack against Israel, against they tried to hit Israel's water carrier in order to be able to, from the last I read, to add way too high levels of chlorine that would have sickened a number of Israeli customers of that water carrier. So Israel presumably retaliated and took down one of Iran's biggest port, I believe it was, or one of its biggest ports in the Gulf. And pretty much from what I understand, just by taking that down in a cyber attack, it was essentially a mess for 3 days. Iran couldn't import, export, do anything for 3 days just from this one attack. Is this like the first major, I don't want to say kinetic, but the first major crossover of a cyber attack that actually was successful in the real world?
Well, that's an excellent question. It may be the first one that we've heard of, or at least heard this much about. There have been possible indications in the past. We have not seen evidence of cyber activity, but there have been slowdowns of activity that suggest someone has come under a cyber attack that seems to be at the state level. That has happened with some of China's neighbors, the ones that dispute with China the holdings in the South China Sea. So what I suspect this may be is the first one that we recognize with fairly good certainty for what it is. And it's, hats off, hats off to the Israelis, the cyber warriors, for getting that done, assuming that is what happened.
Sure. Actually, as you were mentioning that, I seem to recall, I thought there was Russia managed to do some fairly big damage against Ukraine, if I remember.
They did. There's some dispute about how far that went. Believe it or not, some of it is actually related to the whole Russiagate thing in the United States, the political football.
Mm-hmm.
And the analysis of it done by the firm called CrowdStrike that also did the analysis of the penetration of the Democratic computers in 2016.
Yeah.
But that's a whole kind of separate issue. Bottom line is that it is something that really happens. So, yeah, definitely a significant thing. There have been a number of reports that turned out to be false about attacks of that kind. One thing I would mention, though, one thing that's pretty important. Back in the 2015 time frame, there appeared to be evidence that Patriot missile batteries that were deployed to Turkey for for theater defense against Iranian missiles were hacked in some way, and that they had unauthorized commands sent to them. And those missile batteries ended up being removed from Turkey and some different ones sent in. And there was never a whole lot of information about that in public. I believe that came out through a German. It was a professional journal that was reporting on information that they got from the BND, the German intelligence service, the Bundesnachrichtendienst. So, and the thinking was that it was probably the Russians who were behind that, but those attempts at really big cyber attacks are out there.
Sure. Wow. I don't recall reading about that Patriot missile attack, so that's really interesting. I mean, speaking of that, it's I mean, do you have any doubt, for example, that China is trying to use Huawei as essentially a means to eavesdrop on the entire world?
Zero doubt. The U.S. military has come up with so much evidence that buying parts from China means buying surveillance by China that I don't have any doubt about that whatsoever. The U.S. in fact, police departments around the country have been using drones during the coronavirus crisis, which now seems like an antique.
Right.
Some of them were using drones to look for clumps of people, and it turned out that what they were doing was they had those drones on loan from a Chinese company.
Yeah.
And both the U.S. Navy, the U.S. Army, and the Department of Homeland Security had all analyzed the drones and their communications profile and their components and so forth, and determined that it isn't difficult at all to hack into what those drones are doing, and you could do it from a wireless connection close to where the drone is operating, or just go to a central site that its signal goes through. Either way, you can hack in and you can send it commands, and you can download all the information that's streaming through it. You could find all the information you wanted about police chains of command, U.S. police operations. You could look at video, the video display of what was going on in U.S. cities. So, yeah, I have no doubt.
It's funny because I at my regular day job once, a person told me that they found these really inexpensive home security cameras, like $25 a piece or something. So I was like, oh, that's pretty cool. So I looked it up and I looked at the reviews, and people were saying, I'm sniffing the traffic. It's going to China. And this is just home video security stuff. So there's looks like Chinese spying is happening at all levels, whether it's consumer or whether it's communications, telco type things, and it's really something to see. One last question, just to see what you say. We have no idea what's going to happen in November. What are your impressions of how Biden would be as a commander-in-chief?
Well, my impression is that he wouldn't be the commander-in-chief.
If it happened.
Right, he would just be managed by, and I'm not sure even his cabinet members would be in charge so much as people behind the scenes whose names we would barely even know.
Uh-huh.
That's my impression.
So you think he would be manipulated? What's your impression of Trump as a commander in chief?
I think he has his drawbacks, but in general, he's been good so far. Probably his greatest strength is also his greatest drawback. Um, People got used to not hearing very much from the U.S. president during the Obama years because, in terms of security policy, global politics, Obama really rarely said anything.
Mhm.
And we used to, those of us who wrote about those things used to chuckle amongst ourselves that we had to visit the Oracle at Delphi or read chicken entrails to figure out what was coming from the Obama administration.
Mhm.
So people have gotten accustomed to that. And Trump is also not very communicative on those things. So, you have to figure out what he's doing. And he is actually, I'm undecided as to, whether he's a savant, kind of what they call an idiot savant,
Right.
or if he really knows his stuff and he understands what he's doing. But he's very good at coming in from an unexpected vector on international affairs, uh, national security, and so forth. And he has been able to make good things happen, but he does it without the political messaging that is reassuring to the world and is actually, it's a very stabilizing thing if you go ahead and do it right. Um, George W. Bush is the last president that we had who really did that. And Bill Clinton tried to do it. He made the effort. He made pro forma efforts, and he wasn't all that good at it. But both Bushes and Reagan, uh, Nixon was actually very good at it, sending signals. Kennedy was better at doing that than he was at actually following through. But he did know how to set up structured expectations, and Eisenhower was very good at it.
Hmm.
So we had a long series of presidents there who were, for the most part, pretty good at framing expectations so that the expectations themselves were stabilizing. And Trump doesn't do that, and I think that's one of his biggest drawbacks. But on the other hand, he's done some really great stuff. I think his policy with Israel is spot on. It's a stabilizing policy, and it has made things more stable and more likely to remain relatively secure there in the Middle East.
Mhm.
Uh, I attribute Trump's policies on Israel for the increased, the warming up between some of the Arab nations, the important ones, Saudi Arabia, for example, and Egypt and Israel, and then some of the Gulf nations, UAE and Bahrain, the warming relations with Israel. I think a lot of that has to do with Trump's policies on Israel, and it's a very good thing to see. Whether his unique, unconventional approach is going to work with North Korea, for example, or China, the jury's still out on that. But one thing that I would like to leave you with this: we went for years with dithering six-party talks with North Korea that just went on, and nothing ever got better. North Korea would throw a tantrum every now and then and get some more concessions, and then would continue marching on toward the bomb. And it was during the period when we were doing those six-party talks. And the whole thing about those six-party talks is that the entree to North Korea for everybody was China.
Mhm.
And what Trump has done with his outreach to North Korea is knock China out. We don't have to go through China anymore to get to North Korea. And that's one reason that China has gone high order, is that that really messed with uh, their security arrangement there in the Far East. There's now a real possibility that a rapprochement of North and South on the Korean Peninsula could be could be sponsored without China being in the driver's seat.
Hmm.
So in that way, it's been very effective. We're not sure how it's all going to end, but it's really important to be able to see and understand that, to know, to get a feel for how Trump gets things done.
That's a very interesting point. That's that certainly is a major loss for China politically, to lose that role and to be and essentially it was probably as much of a gatekeeper as it was a facilitator in that communication. So that's really very interesting. Okay, thank you very much. This was really great. I learned a lot. Again, I apologize for the technical difficulties and there was some again the audio problems, but this is what happens when you do live stuff. Again, this thank you very much to J.E. Dyer. You can read her stuff on Liberty Unyielding is the blog that she as well as a number of other people are on. You can also follow her on Twitter, and I'm sure in a few number of other places. But for now, I am Elder of Zion. Thank you very much, Jennifer, for coming. I appreciate it. And that's it. So goodbye, and I will see everybody next time.
Okay, are we off?
Yeah, now we're off. Yeah.